The Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the spending priorities and missions of the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. We appreciate it. We're here today to examine the budget and priorities of the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service. From BLM, we are pleased to have Deputy Director Brian Steed before us today. From the Forest Service, I would like to welcome Chief Vicki Christensen. Thank you so much. Collectively, BLM and the Forest Service manage 438 million acres of national forests and public lands for the benefit of all Americans and over 700 million acres of subsurface mineral rights. Americans need our public lands to support clean water, recreation, and wildlife. But your budgets prioritize oil, gas, mining, and timber above all else. Although climate change is disproportionately impacting our public lands, the BLM and Forest Service budgets hardly mention this critical issue. Instead, they request that Congress cut investment in climate and science programs. The BLM and Forest Service budgets request zero funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, despite overwhelming bipartisan support for the recently enacted John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act, which included a permanent reauthorization of the fund. The Forest Service's budget encourages more shared stewardship, yet cuts the very programs intended to support cooperation, financial and technical assistance to states, including eliminating funding for the successful Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. Looking back, it's also clear that the 35-day shutdown harmed our public lands. While the administration charged ahead with issuing oil and gas leases during the lapse, they effectively put a stop to the Forest Service's important fire preparedness activities, including canceling prescribed burning and delays in the hiring and training to wildland firefighters. On a positive note, fiscal year 20 is the first time the BLM and the Forest Service will be able to fully deploy new wildfire suppression funding as provided by Congress in the FY18 Omnibus. I'm pleased to see that the BLM and the Forest Service have embraced this approach and made a full request for the new suppression cap adjustment. I hope to hear about your expectations for the upcoming fire season and how you will be using existing management authorities in prioritizing community safety. Before we hear today's testimony, I would like to say that thus far I have been underwhelmed by the testimony of some of your colleagues at the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service. We're here today to talk about your proposed budgets and this administration's priorities. I need not be reminded that Congress has the power of the purse. People in New Mexico cherish our public lands for clean water, recreation, and wildlife. Based on this budget, I'm not sure that this administration shares the same values. I see the Department of Interior moving at a breakneck pace to open new areas to oil and gas drilling all over the United States, including protected and culturally important areas like Chaco Canyon, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and the lands stripped from Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monuments. The Forest Service is similarly being pressured under an extractive agenda that prioritizes timber targets over community safety and ecological restoration. In numerous states, the Forest Service is considering costly and questionably motivated state roadless rules, putting millions of acres of protected lands on the chopping block. In places like Minnesota, the Forest Service and BLM are jointly responsible for putting valuable freshwater resources at risk from mining pollution. Our national parks, forests, and public lands should be managed for all Americans, not just a few. I recognize that the BLM and Forest Service face many challenges when it comes to prioritizing funding, but I expect assurances that this administration's budget and priorities are not coming at the expense of future generations. I thank you for being here today to testify, for your leadership. I look forward to hearing your statements and your answers to our questions, and I look forward to your testimony. I now recognize Ranking Member Curtis for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as you noted, today's subcommittee meets to review the 2020 fiscal budget of the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. Collectively, these two agencies manage roughly 20% of the land in the United States. And as many know, that's considerably much higher in my own state, about 50 million acres, 30 million acres, or 57% of the land in my state is managed by these two agencies. And in my district, some counties are over 90% of public land. And as a former mayor, I frequently find myself asking how they manage to pave roads and provide police officers without the major source of revenues that many other counties experience. I highlight these numbers to emphasize the magnitude of influence these two agencies yield. The decisions made by these agencies have very real impacts on the environment, our economy, and our communities. I welcome the opportunity to examine and discuss the priorities put forth in the President's budget. While the budget process provides valuable insight into the priorities, with the Chair, I note that the spending decisions are congressional responsibility. An important part of the Natural Resources Committee oversight responsibility is to look at these budgets and to review them and make tough decisions. I believe the requests present a number of excellent opportunities for bipartisan collaboration. One prime example of bipartisan opportunities is the joint emphasis from the BLM and Forest Service to meaningfully address the ongoing wildfire crisis impacting our nation's forest and rangeland. In coordination with this budget process, the BLM and Forest Service have collaborated on a proposed package of common sense reforms to reduce catastrophic fire risk and improve forest and fire rangeland health. These fires are a national emergency that need to be taken seriously. Just last year, wildfires in the United States consumed over 8.5 million acres of land and wreaked havoc on several communities throughout the West. In Utah alone, almost 500,000 acres were destroyed, disrupting the livelihoods of many communities in my district. Sadly, last year was not an outlier, as we have continuously seen this type of destruction each year. I support the collaborative efforts of these agencies to deal with this issue. It is vital that we proactively manage our forests and rangelands, and I look forward to hearing about the ways our land management agencies intend to use their existing authorities to achieve these goals. I also commend the commitment both have shown in this budget to manage the lands currently within the federal estate, as well as the continuing push to address the growing maintenance backlog plaguing our federal land and management agencies. Republicans on this committee are ready to work on these issues of shared concerns. I'd now like to yield some time to my friend from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman. He's been a great leader on many federal lands issues, and especially on forestry and wildfire prevention. Regrettably, another committee conflict prevents him from staying at this hearing, so I'd like to yield my balance of my time to Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Representative Curtis, and thank you for everyone for being here today. At the DOI budget hearing, I quoted Theodore Roosevelt, where he said, "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better." This is a hearing for the critics. We convene not to talk about policy, not to talk about solutions for our national forest, but to point, to jeer, and to criticize the Trump administration for merely advancing a budget. And my father taught me to be careful when you point the finger, because there's three pointing back at you. And if we want to talk about budgets, let's consider the fingers pointing back at Congress today. Madam Chair, you appropriately stated that Congress controls the purse strings, and I couldn't agree with that more. The administration budget is a suggestion. Congress controls the budget, but here we are. Friday, coming up, marks the 100th day of this Congress, and we haven't even seen a remote hint of a budget. Not a budget on the floor we could vote on, not even a budget out of committee. So I find it ironic that we're here today chastising the administration for putting a budget suggestion forward when we have no budget of our own. Even the movie critic sometimes gives a good review. So I would like to start today by taking a different perspective on this hearing and actually applaud the Trump administration for advancing smart policies like active forest management in this budget proposal. This proposal seeks to implement several key provisions from the Residual Federal Forestry Act, which passed out of the House last year with bipartisan support. This committee has seen time and time again the absolute need for managing our nation's forest, and I would like to commend the Trump administration for being in the ring, for being the doers of deeds that our nation's forests and public lands desperately need. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. Thank you, Ranking Member Curtis. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but you may submit a longer statement for the record if you choose. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left and red when the time has expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Brian Steed, Deputy of Policy and Programs at the Bureau of Land Management. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Curtis, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the President's fiscal year 2020 budget request for the Bureau of Land Management. As was stated in the outset, the BLM manages approximately 245 million acres of surface estate and over 700 million acres of subsurface mineral estate throughout the United States. BLM lands are some of North America's most wild, historic, and scenic landscapes. These federal lands support the production of goods and services that create jobs and promote economic development across the nation. The 2020 BLM budget request is $1.2 billion, including $1.08 billion for the management of lands and resources appropriation and $1.7 million for the Oregon and California grant lands appropriation. The FY 2020 budget supports opportunities for conservation, outdoor recreation, sustainable timber harvesting, grazing, and responsible energy and mineral development. Public lands offer many recreational opportunities, including hunting, fishing, camping, and other outdoor activities. In 2008, the BLM managed lands hosted over 67.9 million visitors, a number that's expected to grow to over 70 million visitors in 2020. The budget request promotes a balanced approach to managing our recreational lands and cultural resources. The budget proposes $54.8 million for the recreation resources management and $37.1 million for the National Monuments and National Conservation Areas program. With this money, the BLM will continue to manage and support visitation to designated historic landmarks, prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest on public lands. In addition, the Cultural Resources Management Program, which supports the inventory, protection, and stabilization of BLM cultural sites, will receive $15.6 million in FY 2020. As this committee is aware, last year was one of the nation's most devastating wildfire seasons. As such, the budget supports the administration's priority for promoting active management of the nation's forest and rangelands to reduce wildfire risk. The BLM budget invests $10.2 million in 2020 for forest management on public domain lands and also requests $107 million in the Oregon and California grant lands appropriation. This will lay the groundwork to increase the amount of timber offered to 280 million board feet in the ONC lands in 2021, reflecting BLM's commitment to advance timber production and forest health. Along with these investments, the administration proposes a package of forest management legislative reforms, which include categorical exclusions for fuels management work. These authorities will improve the ability to treat additional acres more effectively and efficiently, thereby reducing catastrophic fire risk and progressing towards more resilient landscapes and fire-adapted communities. The BLM continues to focus work on the land resources, wildlife and aquatics, recreation management, and resource protection and maintenance activities. These activities support the department's high-priority goals, including increasing access to public lands, expanding recreational opportunities nationwide, and enhancing shared conservation. Balancing habitat conservation and responsible use of public land resources ensures the best outcome for the people and wildlife that rely on these lands. The BLM budget request builds on the results of ongoing efforts, including implementing outcome-based grazing and recent sage-grouse management plan amendments, which better align federal habitat conservation efforts with state wildlife management plans. The BLM will also invest in habitat identification and habitat restoration efforts across multiple program areas and in coordination with states, which will support big game and migration corridors. Finally, the budget request includes funding to continue identifying innovative ways to address the growing impact that wild horse and burro populations put on ecosystems, and on taxpayer resources. The BLM takes pride in its collaborative efforts to increase access and enhance outdoor recreation opportunities, maintain productive working landscapes for grazing and timber, and promote responsible energy production. The President's FY 2020 budget request for the BLM provides the necessary tools for the Bureau to continue to provide sustainable benefits for the nation. Thank you again for the opportunity to present this testimony, and I'd be pleased to respond to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Steed. The chair now recognizes Ms. Christensen, Chief of the U.S. Forest Service, for 5 minutes.
Chair Holland, Mr. Curtis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I deeply appreciate your support as we work to actively and innovatively manage our forests and grasslands through sound stewardship. Today, I will discuss 3 areas of our work: high points in our progress to actively steward the nation's forests and grasslands, our ground plan for 2020, and our work to champion a strong workforce and healthy workplace. Last year was not business as usual for the Forest Service. We made good use of the funds, new authorities, and tools to do more to confront threats facing forests and communities. We increased our work to achieve a 20-year high in forest treatments, yielding 3.2 billion board feet of timber and treating 3.4 million acres to reduce hazardous fuels, surpassing this year's targets. Internally, we're nearing completion of critical reforms that erase process burdens, reduce costs, and break barriers that slow our work. We're close to completing work that streamlines the decision process and meets our environmental responsibility. We took steps to be more cost-effective in fire response and are pursuing long-term actions to reduce costs. We're improving our financial accountability. We understand there is no blank check. We've geared up fully to employ new Farm Bill authorities. They put more science-based tools in our toolbox to do more work. Expansion of Good Neighbor Authority and provisions for wood innovation will rapidly be put to good use. Shared stewardship is fast becoming our preferred mode for doing work. It increases our chance at improving forest health. We've reached out and worked across boundaries to reduce fire risk, improve forest conditions, and help communities. We've increased work with states to execute nearly 200 Good Neighbor agreements in 37 states. New Mexico is a great example of shared stewardship in action. Since 2014, we've worked with the state on 27 restoration projects on national forest lands. Because of that partnership and support, we've been able to restore over 20,000 additional acres of forested lands within all 5 national forests in New Mexico. The Forest Service is well positioned to build on this momentum. The President's $5.7 billion budget places emphasis on our critical work. It focuses on reducing wildland fire risk, improving forest and grassland conditions, and contributing to rural economies. It does reflect tough choices and trade-offs. It helps us build on a shared stewardship approach. In fiscal year 20, we're also pleased the fire funding fix takes effect. The damaging practices of fire transfer will become part of the past. We will no longer sacrifice critical work to pay for firefighting. Lastly, our mission's success depends on a highly skilled, motivated workforce. We will continue our work to end sexual harassment and retaliation. Last year, we listened to employees, we learned from them, and we acted to bring about change. Today, employees are better equipped with new tools, stricter policies, a new code of conduct, and supervisory support. We're better at holding bad actors accountable. Sustained cultural change will take longer than any of us wants, and I'm determined to lead permanent shift in the Forest Service. In turn, we will make good on the investments of this Congress and provide the services and sound stewardship this nation deserves. Thank you. I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Christensen, for that valuable testimony. The chair will now recognize members for questions, and under Committee Rule 3D, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. I'd like to first recognize Mr. Neguse for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today and for your testimony. And while I certainly appreciate you both being here, I do share the concerns of the chair regarding the priorities that are laid out in the Forest Service and BLM budget requests. It's my sense this budget seems to plus up accounts that are politically palatable to this administration while defunding successful programs and ignoring some of the very real needs of local communities. Like our distinguished ranking member, I happen to represent a district that's 52% public lands. And so it's incredibly important for, in my view, the budget of the BLM and the Forest Service to reflect the values of my constituents. And in Colorado's 2nd District, there are a number of local projects that have gone ignored or unfunded, and these issues have been exacerbated following the government shutdown. So just to give you some example, folks from Summit County, Colorado, which I represent, have been working with the Forest Service for several years on a land exchange that has been held up due to forest-wide staffing and workload issues. I would look forward to working with you, Director Christensen, on that front. In addition, 2 years in a row, Summit County has provided funding for the Forest Service Dillon Ranger District to hire, train, and deploy a dispersed recreation crew for the purposes of fire prevention, in addition to public awareness campaigns on fire risk and safety, as well as fire watch patrols. These costs are expected to exceed $200,000 in 2019, and these are costs that the county is bearing rather than the federal government. And so while it certainly doesn't surprise me that my constituents understand the cost of prevention is far less than the cost of disaster, it is deeply concerning that local communities in my district are taking on the financial burden to these programs and services. And finally, in a letter to the Colorado delegation in the summer of 2018, the Northwest Colorado Council of Governments expressed concern that decreased Forest Service funding has meant that the national forests often fail to match the high management standards expected by Colorado communities that are heavily invested in creating a world-class experience on local trails, parks, and open spaces. These communities have been backfilling USFS staffing budgets for a variety of front country ranger roles that were historically fully funded. These are federal forests used by people from across the country, and a well-funded Forest Service, in my view, and I suspect you'd agree, is a federal responsibility. So with that, Ms. Christensen, I want to go back to the issue I mentioned around Summit County, in particular the dispersed recreation crews. Do you think it is appropriate that counties and local governments are providing, or are being forced essentially, to provide funding for programs under the Forest Service's jurisdiction?
Thank you, Congressman Neguse. I appreciate your concern, and we very much appreciate the outstanding partnerships we have with state and local governments. Through our shared stewardship initiatives, we really feel that we are residents in those states and those public lands we manage, and we share in the priority setting and the urgent needs together across all governments. As you well know, recreation is a significant part of this nation, outdoor recreation, this nation's economy. Visits to the national forests alone create nearly $10 billion in gross in GDP in this nation. And so we do appreciate the help and support of the vitality that these lands do bring for the gateway communities around Colorado. We did have to prioritize our resources. We adhered to the administration's instruction to take a 5% reduction from the 2019 proposed budget, and we did prioritize critical work to reduce the risk of catastrophic fire, improve forest conditions across the National Forest System lands. Therefore, we are very appreciative of the partnership we have with our local communities.
Thank you, Dr. Christensen. I guess what I would say is, While I appreciate your comments, perhaps this is an issue that my colleagues and I can work on both sides of the aisle, particularly from Western states, the notion that the burden would be placed on localities and counties. I know, given your background in the state of Arizona and the state of Washington, you know these issues well from a state and local perspective, and so would just ask you to work with us to find a way to partner so that local counties are not footing the bill, because ultimately the fire prevention work they're engaged in is so important.
I'd be happy to.
And then lastly, I just want to point out the Secure Rural Schools program, which obviously I know you are well familiar with, a critical funding source that many communities in my district rely on, is set to expire at the end of the fiscal year. In the next few weeks, I'll be introducing legislation to provide additional short-term funding for SRS, and so look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure that this bipartisan program is continually funded to the next year, and hopefully we can have the Forest Service's support. With that, I yield back.
Be happy to.
Thank you, Mr. Neguse. The chair now recognizes Mr. Curtis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Steed, I suspect you're as familiar as anybody with the Emory County Public Lands Bill, and appreciate your ties to Utah. Really pleased with that bill. It's a great representation of bipartisan work and doing something that's rarely done here in Congress and finding a happy place with these public lands. However, I'm sure you feel the weight of that bill in your department. There's a lot of work for your department. The Sitla exchanges, the San Rafael Swell management plan, the Jurassic Monument Management Plan. Can you share with us how you're hoping to deal with these new responsibilities given the limited resources that you have?
Certainly, Mr. Curtis, thank you so much for the question. And as you well know, a lot of work went into that bill, a lot of local investment, as well as, and I can say from the BLM side, a lot of work from the BLM. At one point, I walked into our Washington, D.C. office over at M Street and saw that we had essentially a wallpapering of various maps from Emory County to determine what the final configuration of that congressional ask would be. So it's been an interesting process to watch. As you noted, now that the bill is passed, we have our work to do. And there is a variety of things that we will be rolling out over the upcoming months to make sure that we get it right. I have heard both from state representation as well as from Sitla regarding the importance of those land exchanges, and I'll commit my office to take that work up to make sure it's done in as expeditious a manner as possible. And then all the other variety changes that go into that. As you know, there's an additional 600,000 acres of wilderness, and getting those marked as well as determined on the map on exact locations will be something that we'll be engaged in over the next few months, and we're happy to keep you apprised.
Thank you. We appreciate your efforts and your attention, as well as the Price Field Office, and realize that we're asking a lot. I would just emphasize, as you have, that the Sitla exchange is not only good for the environment, it's great for Utah school kids. It's just a win-win all around, so thank you. Another issue that dominates, not just in my district, but in that of Representative Chris Stewart, are these issue with wild horse and Bureau population. We've seen just a catastrophic crisis. You just drive through parts of my district and you can see the inhumane nature of this. It's just not a good situation. And not only is it unfortunate for this horse population, but it's not good for the land. And I guess I'd like to know, in your opinion, does the Bureau have the resources that you need from Congress to deal with this, and what's still lacking for you to be able to do more work in this area?
Congressman, as you know, multiple use is always a balancing act. One of the hardest parts of that balancing act that we have is Congress has instructed us to be in charge of the wild horse and burro populations roaming, well, exclusively the western United States. When we look at those numbers, when we look at what Congress intended in the 1971 Act versus what there are on the range now, we see horses have done what horses will do, which is they have bred. They have multiplied, and it turns out we now have from 3 to 4 times the number of horses on the range as was initially envisioned. that creates its own unique management problems in a variety of areas, and I'll just cite one. While yes, we have many problems in Utah regarding very large herds, some of the herds we have in Nevada are hundreds of, well over double, triple, quadruple the size of what the environment can sustain. The problem is often framed in the sense of horses versus other multiple uses. My concern is it's becoming horses versus the environment. And I could take you to areas in Nevada specifically where horses are of such a high population they've eaten down to the ground. We are committed to getting in front of the problem. We are committed to resolving those environmental concerns. We have limited tools that we're able to employ. One of those tools will be an aggressive gather schedule to make sure that we can bring as many of those herds down to appropriate size as possible. And then we have a problem what to do with those horses afterwards. And so we are trying to get as many of those horses adopted as well as to find long-term solutions where we can keep those horses.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you. I'd like to submit for the record a question about NEPA and the way that's impacting your work on this as well. Thank you. Madam Chairman, I yield my time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Thank you. And the chair now recognizes Mr. Huffman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, and thanks to our witnesses. Mr. Steed, a quick question related to telecommunications on federal land. Chief Christensen, in a written testimony, highlighted the Forest Service's new fee retention authority for communication sites. I previously introduced a bill that addresses this issue, the Public Lands Telecommunications Act, and it was unanimously approved by this committee. Would have provided the Forest Service and DOI land management agencies with cooperative agreement and fee retention authority to leverage public lands for broadband deployment. And so, very important to my constituents, and I know I'm not alone. Lots of rural communities, and including many in the West, would benefit from this. So I wanted to ask if your agency would benefit from this type of fee retention authority to support the use of BLM lands for telecommunication facilities.
Congressman, I really appreciate the question. It's something that we've put a pretty big emphasis on over the last year, is broadband development. In many places, because of the distribution of BLM lands, we end up being a large sea of federal land in the midst of communities throughout that land. As such, it's important that we are able to develop that infrastructure in order to have communications within those communities. We're committed to that outcome, and we'd be happy to discuss further. I'm not familiar, I'm sorry to say, with the specifics of your bill, but we'd be happy to discuss further. And certainly, it's a major importance to the DOI that we increase the amount of broadband distribution across the West.
Great. Well, I would commend you to look at the Forest Service and how it is working to use that authority, and I look forward to continuing that conversation. Chief Christensen, you know better than many that 2018 was the largest, deadliest, and most destructive wildfire season in recorded history in California. There is an urgent need to invest in high-priority restoration and community protection efforts across all types of forest ownership in our state. About half the state's 33 million forested acres are managed by the federal government, with a lot of that being national forest lands. And I'm pleased to see that the state of California is making an unprecedented commitment of $1 billion, a 5-year commitment to improving forest health and resilience. This is funded partially by money from carbon credits under state law. Unfortunately, the budget provided by the Forest Service fails to make similar investments. And so I wanted to ask you about that, especially since FY20 is the first opportunity to deploy the fire funding fix, which you mentioned in your testimony, fixing budget cap adjustments enacted by Congress in the FY18 omnibus. I was hoping that this budget would increase some of the accounts that have been negatively affected by this annual practice of fire borrowing, including a focus on restoration, clean water, recreation, and wildlife. But unfortunately, we're not seeing that. We're going the other direction on many of these accounts. And so I just want to ask you, especially in light of this terrible fire season and every indication that we'll see more fires like that, more fire seasons like that, why is forest health and resilience not a priority in this budget?
Thank you, Congressman. We share your concern. The fire funding fix will absolutely stabilize our operating environment in that it's highly unlikely we will have to borrow funds in the middle of a fire year.
Right.
With that said, in the development of the 2020 budget proposal, we followed administration's guidance to reduce by 5% from the 19 budget proposal. So we did not take a across-the-board cut. We made some very tough choices, and our number one priority was the reduction of risks of fire and more active management or improving forest conditions. In your state alone, we have increased our footprint on how much hazardous fuels we're getting treated. We have committed with the state of California that we will, so we treated 322,000 acres just in our national forest lands in California. We've committed to up that to 500,000 acres. That means we're going to have to prioritize our resources. We did, in this 2020 proposal, ask for a slight increase in both our hazardous fuels and our forest management budget lines.
Chief, in the limited time I have, I appreciate that timber production is up and that you're working on some of those fronts, but when I look specifically at the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, no funding, zeroed out. When I look at state and private forestry programs, deep
Gentleman's
cuts,
time has expired.
it represents a disconnect between the rhetoric about shared stewardship and the programs that actually make it happen, and I appreciate the Chair's indulgence and yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Huffman. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Cook for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just to continue in this conversation a little bit, I'm not trying to beat a dead horse, but everybody from California and the western states, at least I do. I think it's a long ways from Washington to California. And this year, obviously, the national news, the wildfires, just absolutely horrible. And so I think you're going to see, at least for me and other people on this dais, the same questions over and over again. When are you going to do it? Where's the battle plan? And no excuses. That's just the way it is because we had a tremendous amount of rain this year. We had snow. It's melting. Things are growing, which are going to contribute to the danger this year again. So I'm going to make an impassioned plea. This has got to be a top priority, not business as usual. The western states, this is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is something. Pardon the bad pun, but we've been burned, and people have died. And so I'll get off that, but I think, anyway. The other thing I want to just bang the drum on is we had a bipartisan bill, that the lands package, that I had a lot of stuff, if you will, in there because it was a huge bill. And we're very, very interested that some of these things will get done as soon as possible. We had bipartisan land exchange. I know Congressman Aguilar and I in our district were, and I've got to, sometimes Senator Feinstein and I don't always get along, but she helped me so much in an exchange of land around Mammoth Mountain. It was forest land and everything else. And those things, I think, work. And so I got to tell you, I'm old and irritable, and I'm probably going to be after you to get it done. And why? Because I am a pest. So I'm just forewarned. And I see Congressman McClintock smiling, even though he missed the last Don Young sensitivity training session. The last thing I have to do to keep my marriage intact is address the wild horses and the wild burros situation. I don't know. I've been hearing about this. It's what they do with those. It's, we come from, my wife loves horses more than me. And a lot of households are very, very similar, and cats and dogs and everything like that. But it's a big, big issue. It's, as you know. Somebody proposed something like veterinarians that have all that debt that they have accumulated. Can you have a program where they go out and they sterilize many of these animals and they relieve part of that debt that they have been carrying for years and years. We need more vets. We need some kind of incentive program, I think, that would do that. So the other thing is, I think I had a lot of things. Some of the last farm bill, or one of the farm bills, we had a lot of categorical exclusions that were kicked out by the Senate of that program about that. Some of are going to be addressed, but I just want to make sure that we continue the study of dead timber and fuels. You talk to all the firefighters. What do they talk about? Fuel, fuel, fuel. And the way those, and I obviously have a district, we've had our problems as a mayor going back and forth. So you got a tough job, and I apologize for dealing with old crotchety former Marines that you're going to hear more from me over and over again. But thank you for testifying. You didn't get a chance to say much, but any comments in my 41 seconds?
On fire, yes, we'll be very aggressive this year and totally understand the problem. On the implementation of S47, similarly, the acting secretary has made a priority for us to implement this. He's created a secretarial order specific to that to make sure that we implement. And on wild horses, we are working very aggressively to increase any number of fertility treatments that can deal with this problem humanely, and I'll leave it at that. Happy for follow-up, though.
Thank you.
And I just add to Mr. Steed's commitment. I've assembled a team for implementation of the lands package. We are aggressively increasing our hazardous fuels treatment. We're using many of the tools Congress has given us and focused our priority about the highest risk acres, high risk to communities.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cook. The chair now recognizes Mr. McClintock for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I first want to thank Chief Christensen and just report to this committee that within days of her being named acting chief, she spent Mother's Day, and she's a mom herself, spent Mother's Day to travel to California to see the condition of our forests firsthand and listen to all of the concerns that were expressed by our mountain community. And I again want to thank her for that commitment and dedication. First question obviously involves the pace and scale of forest management. I think we are making progress on getting some bipartisan recognition of the scope of the problem, that the wildfires are due to morbid overcrowding of our forests, and that reduction of excess timber is absolutely essential to protect the water supply and restore forest and watershed health. In December of 2018, the Forest Service gave the final environmental approval of the French Meadows project. That's a 29,000-acre landscape scale project to restore forest health and resilience and reduce the risk of high-severity wildfire in the headwaters of the American River, which is a critical municipal watershed located in my congressional district. Chief Christensen, Congress provided the Forest Service with additional tools to reduce hazardous fuels and protect vital watersheds in recent appropriations and in the 2018 Farm Bill and in the WIN Act. Can you tell us what the Forest Service is now doing to carry out these provisions to expedite collaborative landscape scale forest restoration projects?
You bet, Congressman. We absolutely appreciate all the work Congress has done bipartisan for these new tools, and we are getting them actively on the ground. Immediately after the omnibus last year, we updated every one of our Good Neighbor Authority agreements to add the provision to be able to do road maintenance and reconstruction. That opened up a much more opportunity to work with our state partners at the landscape scale. That made a big difference. On the authorities and the insects and disease designations, we have 183 categorical exclusions across 25 states where we're really implementing these categorical exclusions for these high-risk areas to get more work done. Additionally, we are close to getting, we already have one 20-year stewardship agreement signed, and we're getting close for a second one in Arizona. When we have 20-year surety, we can attract the private sector infrastructure that is needed to process this small wood that is not marketable now. And I think you know, Congressman, in California with the right-of-way provisions, we've signed a master MOU for all of the maintenance and operations with the two largest utilities in California, so they can get in without all of the bureaucratic work and get the critical maintenance of those lines done to reduce hazard. In addition to that, the agency ourselves, we're doing process reform work so we can get good science-based, data-driven environmental analysis done, but that it is delayering the years of process to get that done.
That's precisely the problem. We just heard this was the most destructive fire in California history. That's actually not the least bit true. We did lose 1.5 million acres in California last year. And when we managed our forests properly in the last half of the 20th century, we only lost 250,000 acres. So that's a huge increase in acres destroyed by fire. But what we forget is in pre-Columbian times, California lost typically between 4.5 and 11 million acres a year to catastrophic wildfire. That's nature's way of managing a forest. Just like any untended garden, it will grow and grow until it chokes itself to death. It burns, and then over the next century, it slowly returns. We established the Forest Service precisely to break this cycle, to introduce sound scientific and active management of our forests, and the Forest Service did so magnificently until we passed laws in the 70s that made active forest management endlessly time-consuming and ultimately cost-prohibitive. Excess timber comes out in one of two ways. It's either carried out or it burns out. When we carried it out, we had healthy and resilient forests. We actually made money for the federal treasury. 25% of those revenues went to local governments. Let me ask you, in the limited time I've got left, what do you need us to do to get out of the way and let you do your job again?
Thank you, Congressman. We just need to be able to put these new authorities on the ground, and we want to continue to work with you both on the budget proposals and the legislative proposals, because we, as you said, we have unlimited challenges, we have big needs on the landscape, and we want to continue to work with you on both those fronts.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. McClintock. The chair now recognizes Mr. Horsford for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the chairwoman for organizing today's hearing, examining the budget priorities of the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. The Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service perform vital missions throughout the United States, and particularly in my home state of Nevada. In my state, the U.S. Forest Service manages approximately 3.5 million acres of national forest, while the Bureau of Land Management manages 67% of land in Nevada, totaling about 48 million acres of public land. Unfortunately, the Trump administration fiscal year 2020 budget recommends cuts to many important federal programs overseen by the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service. In the last 2 years, the Trump administration has expedited permitting to promote extractive industries rather than support programs to address climate change. This budget proposal is no different. To my alarm, after both houses of Congress voted near unanimously for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, permanently reauthorizing it with the passage of S. 47, the Trump budget proposes the elimination of the Land and Water Conservation Fund in both the BLM and U.S. Forest Service budgets. Both budgets also propose consolidation of programs and funding, meaning there will be less accountability and oversight of how this funding is allocated. It is essential that Congress ensure taxpayer money is spent to the best interest of all Americans, especially those who depend on the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service for their livelihood and safety. So to the speakers today, in the 2 years of the Trump administration, the BLM and U.S. Forest Service have shown a tendency to promote extractive industries and antiquated management practices. The administration has ignored the best available science at the cost of the environment and the American public. Considering the Trump administration has shown irresponsible and concerning tendencies when managing public lands, Would you agree it is inadvisable to consolidate budgets and promote the risk that more federal funding be misspent and poorly allocated?
As to the gentleman's question, I don't believe that the money that we're being allocated is being misspent or misallocated, and I will just push back a little on that to say I understand that in the gentleman's home state we have 67% of the lands. We try very, very hard to meet the mandates that Congress has given us. Congress in FLTMA set up multiple use and sustained yield as our core mission. Part of that involves the mineral estate, of which Nevada has a great deal of mineral estate, and we're trying to do that in a balanced way. Congress has asked us to develop those minerals as well as to take into consideration the environmental consequences of those actions, and it's always a balancing act.
I don't disagree. I've worked on legislation that achieves that balance, but you need the resources to be able to adequately do that. And I don't know how you can rightfully contend based on this budget that you will be able to deliver the federal responsibility to manage this land appropriately. Let me move on to another issue. The Duckwater Shoshone tribe has been waiting more than 5 years now for the BLM to complete surveys to approve a congressionally authorized land expansion for the tribe. Has the BLM money been allocated to facilitate this process? And can I get a guarantee that the BLM will follow through with the Duckwater Shoshone land survey?
And I'm sorry, Congressman, I'm not familiar with the status on that, but I'm happy to follow up.
If you would please provide a response to the committee.
Thank you.
Ms. Christensen, I am sure you are aware that excessive numbers of wild horse and burros pose a host of threats to Nevada's rangelands. What is the Forest Service doing to manage their impact on Nevada's national forest?
Yeah, I really understand this is a significant issue, and we are working with the BLM to set appropriate management levels. Mr. Steed gave a very good overview of the challenges. We work in combination for removals and contraceptive treatments, and to identify the best management tools to meet the Wild and Burro Act and to our multiple use mandate and a healthy ecosystem environment. It is a challenge, but we're committed as a priority.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up with you on that. I am getting an inordinate amount of requests from constituents on that issue.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Steed, I was pleased when the opening lines of BLM's budget request recognized the unique lands that your agency protects. Millions of acres of wildlife habitat, 27 national monuments, 224 wilderness areas, 69 wild and scenic rivers, and some of our nation's most significant cultural and scientific resources, which some of us are working hard to see as many as we can in our lifetime. It's an interesting choice to foreground these resources when this administration's priorities require opening public lands to extractive development. I want to direct your attention briefly to the screen above, and this is what we received. Can you help explain this document, Mr. Steed?
I'm sorry, I don't know what this document is.
Okay, as you know, the committee sent the Department of Interior a document request on the President's illegal shrinking of our national monuments, which was carried out through your agency. And committee staff and I found nearly 100 pages just like this in response to that request. I believe those are wingdings. This document was between transcripts from hearings we held in this committee and emails about Bring Your Dog to Work Day at the Department of Interior. I don't know about you, Mr. Steed, but I take the disenfranchisement of Native peoples very seriously. I don't think these documents constitute a very thorough or appropriate response, and I can't imagine you do either. Particularly, I don't understand this response because our recent Interior Department budget hearing included emails that prove that the Department of the Interior subjects all documents this committee receives to an extraordinary political review process. Despite this thorough vetting, the DOI's response included 100 pages of visual nonsense and thousands of pages of totally non-responsive data. Can you explain why this committee should consider this your best effort? And yes, can you?
Chairwoman, I can't defend that. I don't know what that is. Okay, and we'll be happy to follow up to see where the status on those document requests are.
I would appreciate that very much. Thank you. So just to remind you, this committee specifically requested documents by name, but the DOI failed to include those documents in its over 19,000-page response. I understand that the documents provided were only a partial response to our request, but when can the committee expect to receive the remainder of that request?
Chairwoman, the document requests are handled by the Office of Congressional and Legislative Affairs. I'm not sure if I can give a date certain on that, but I'm happy to follow up with them.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. And next, while we're discussing the disenfranchisement of tribal voices, I want to ask you about BLM's attempt to drill for oil and gas around the Chaco Culture National Historic Park and within the greater Chaco landscape. That this region is sacred to the Pueblo Indians. It's my ancestral homeland. It's also sacred to the Navajo Nation and the National Congress of American Indians and the All Pueblo Council of Governors, which has been organized in the Southwest for hundreds and hundreds of years. They strongly objected to drilling near these sacred sites. And so, Mr. Steed, approximately how much BLM managed land in the greater Chaco region is already leased for oil and gas development? Do you know that?
I don't know an answer off the top of my head, but I can certainly follow up with that.
Okay, that would be great if you can include that when you submit the other documents. And since January 2017, how many times has the BLM proposed to lease parcels of land that fall within 10 miles of Chaco Canyon?
I don't remember, maybe 2 or 3. Each of those times, those actions have been deferred and for further analysis.
Okay, okay, it's been 3, and so they elected to remove these parcels, which you just confirmed, and I find it concerning that the BLM continues to include lands near Chaco Canyon in their proposed oil and gas lease sales when the agency knows full well that local tribal communities oppose drilling in that area, and that drilling would undermine existing protections for cultural resources and sacred sites. Can you commit that the BLM will not include parcels in the future BLM lease sales that fall within the 10-mile buffer zone of the Chaco Canyon?
Chairwoman, we're currently in the process of developing a resource management plan for Farmington. We're in communication with a variety of stakeholders, including the All Pueblo Council of Governors. I've had several interesting meetings with them on how we can best incorporate their expertise in determining cultural resources in the area, and are absolutely willing to continue those efforts.
Thank you. We'd appreciate that greatly. And of course, the tribal voices on this particular issue are of utmost importance. And these are people, my Pueblo people, who have been in this area for hundreds and hundreds of years. And also, not to mention the fact that in northwestern New Mexico, it's the largest methane cloud in the world, hovering above our state. In my estimation, it doesn't do us any good to continue gas and oil drilling in that area, and I yield myself. Thank you so much. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, Without objection, the committee stands adjourned, and I thank you again for your time. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Do I leave this with you?
grab that, yeah.
You guys reuse those, right? Oops. Sorry.